The Coyotes have been running around in a hamster wheel of mediocrity ever since their abrupt 2012 playoff run. Ever since being saved by one city council vote back in 2013, the team had given its fans absolutely nothing to cheer for. Those loyal fans that stuck by during those years of controversy were rewarded with a half-hearted rebuild and incoherent roster construction, all in the faint attempt to finally return to relevance. By 2017, the Coyotes had parted ways with many old faces, including their longtime captain Shane Doan. The team opted to cut their failing rebuild short, trading for several solid players in an effort to retool the roster. The quality of play had certainly improved, but the Coyotes still found themselves searching for their first playoff berth in 7 seasons. The construction of the team was messy, but they still had the talent to break the playoff drought. The Coyotes came out of the gate in 2019-20 with a message to send. After getting their yearly losses to Boston and Anaheim out of the way, they went on a tear for the rest of October, winning 7 of their next 10 games. Kemper was a legitimate top 5 goalie in the NHL, with Ronta behind him who could easily be the starter on several other teams. The combination of great goaltending and timely offense from the likes of Connor Garland and Nick Schmaltz propelled the Coyotes comfortably into a playoff spot, and even leading the Pacific Division by December. While the team was having a hot start, Phil Kessel was hardly the difference maker that John Chaika envisioned, and the offense on the whole was sluggish. Chaika was looking to make another move to jumpstart the offense, and the perfect suitor was coming to town. The New Jersey Devils were sitting far outside of a playoff spot in the East in mid-December, and trade rumors swirled for their star Taylor Hall. The Devils scratched Hall for precautionary reasons against the Avalanche. The next day, the Coyotes traded their 2020 first-round pick and a few prospects for Hall. The trade was well understood to be a rental, with Hall being an RFA after the season. And since the Devils were already in town, Hall just had to trade jerseys and go with his new team. The all-in push would bring some hope for the team into a matchup against the Minnesota Wild. The game started well enough for the Coyotes, but the wheels fell off as they lost 8-5. Despite Ronta being ready on the bench and Kemper having already given up 7 goals on the night, Tocchet left him in the game. This proved to be a disastrous decision with just 3 minutes left in the game. Kemper was completely motionless on the ice after making a save, and he would have to be helped off the ice by medical staff. After the game, Tocchet confirmed that he didn't pull Kemper because he wanted to get him the win. Kemper headed to the IR with a lower body injury, and just 3 days after this team's all-in push began, they suddenly had to play without their best player. From there, the team slowly began to slide out of the playoff picture. Ronta was excellent after being thrust back into the starting role, but the addition of Taylor Hall simply was not bringing in the results. This backslide coincided with several other Western teams going on big winning streaks, and suddenly the Coyotes found themselves on the outside looking in, even after Kemper's return. By March 2020, they were 11th in the Western Conference and sitting 4 points out of a playoff spot. Well, I think we all know what else happened in March 2020. The league suspended play due to the pandemic, and uncertainty was in the air around the world. During the summer, the NHL announced that they would go straight to an expanded playoffs in a closed bubble environment. This format took the top 12 out of 15 teams in each conference, with the top 4 teams completing a round robin for seeding, and the 5 to 12 seeds playing a best-of-5 qualifying series to appear in the actual playoffs. As the 11 seed, the Coyotes faced off against the 6 seed Nashville Predators. Once play began at Rogers Place in Edmonton, Alberta, the Coyotes looked like their early season selves. The top line was finally clicking, as they jumped out to a 3-0 lead in the first period. The Predators would attempt a comeback, but the Coyotes emerged victorious in Game 1. Game 2 was the complete opposite, with Nashville jumping to a 2-0 lead that they would not relinquish. The Coyotes opted to wear the black Kachina jerseys for their designated home games, starting in Game 3. Christian Dvorak would put the Coyotes up early in the first period, but Nashville would answer back halfway through the game. The Predators were dominating this game, but Darcy Kemper stymied their offense from that point forward as the Coyotes pulled out a 4-1 win. The Coyotes were up 2-1 in this best-of-5 series, just needing one more win to return to the playoffs. Michael Grabner and Phil Kessel gave them a 2-0 lead, but the determined Predators offense finally broke through Kemper in the second period to tie the game up. Jordan Osterley would put the Coyotes back in front early into the third period, and after that, it was time to hunker down. The Predators were desperate to avoid going home, and kept the pressure on Kemper. The Coyotes held strong for most of the third period, but Philip Forsberg would tie it up with just over 30 seconds to go. For the first time in this qualifying series, we would need overtime. 5 minutes into the extra period, Vinny Hinostroza throws up a pass to Brad Richardson, who buried it to give the Coyotes the win. The Coyotes won this qualifying series, giving them their first playoff berth since 2012. It may have taken a pandemic stopping play, allowing the team to get healthy, but the Coyotes returned to the playoffs. Their opponent for the next round was determined by a separate round robin, and it was, of course, the Colorado Avalanche. Colorado had stunned the top-seeded Flames in the first round of the year prior, and subsequently have returned to cup contender status. Apart from Darcy Kemper, the Coyotes looked outmatched to start the series. He could only keep the team in the game for so long, as Nazem Kadri gave the Avs the lead on the power play. Just 10 seconds later, JT Conver would extend the lead, and the Avs would ultimately win 3-0. The Coyotes were outshot 40-14, which set the tone of the series early. Nathan MacKinnon would give Colorado an early lead in Game 2, but the Coyotes actually showed some fight in them by answering back and ultimately making it deep into the third, tied 2-2. With just under 3 minutes left, Andrei Burakovsky sniped what would ultimately be the game winner past Kemper. The Coyotes were down 2-0 in the series, and thanks to a tight schedule in the bubble, Game 3 was the next day. Derek Stepan gave the Coyotes an early lead, but they continued to get strong-armed by the Avalanche as the game went on. They tied the game up halfway through the second, but Brad Richardson would give the Coyotes the lead right back by the end of the period. The third period was another constant barrage for Darcy Kemper, but he kept a lid on it as Taylor Hall iced the game for Arizona. Kemper completely stole this game for the team, saving 49 of 51 shots that he faced. The Coyotes avoided a sweep, but their luck ran out just as Game 4 began. The Avalanche jumped to a 3-0 lead in the first period, with Nazem Kadri scoring twice. They eventually chased Kemper from net in their dominant 7-1 win, and blanked the Coyotes' offense yet again. Game 5 would be eerily similar, with Kadri scoring twice again in the first period as the Avs cruised to another 7-1 win. This series was an absolute slaughter from the beginning. Kemper was single-handedly keeping an overmatched squad in these games, but even he couldn't withstand the Avalanche turning up the pressure in the last two games. A disappointing finish, but the Coyotes did officially break their 7-season playoff drought. With the way their season was trending, they probably wouldn't have made it if not for the pandemic. But that's gotta be the most Coyotes way possible that they could have returned to the playoffs, as an 11 seed, a thing that only existed for this extraordinary circumstance. Just one day before these playoffs started, GM John Chaika abruptly resigned from his position. Once the season concluded, the Coyotes hired Bill Armstrong to be their new GM. Armstrong was the director of scouting for the St. Louis Blues for 8 years, a period in which they drafted the likes of Vladimir Tarasenko, Colton Parayko, and Gene Schwartz. This was an excellent hire, actually putting their money where their mouth was in terms of building for a brighter future. This was some uncharacteristically good news for the team. The bad news? It was revealed that Chaika had conducted a private scouting combine with potential future draftees, a practice strictly forbidden by the NHL. The penalty handed down by the league was to strip the Coyotes of their second-round pick in 2020 and their first-round pick in 2021. John Chaika was also suspended from working in the NHL in any capacity for the next year. So, the Coyotes finally got a smart drafter in a time where they wouldn't have a first-round pick for the next 2 years. They didn't have a pick of any kind in the 2020 draft until the fourth round due to all the various shenanigans that Chaika had been pulling. Once the fourth round finally arrived, the Coyotes managed to make the exact wrong pick by selecting defenseman Mitchell Miller. Even though he had the talent of a first-round pick, Miller is also just a complete piece of garbage. He bullied a developmentally disabled classmate in such a deplorable and racially charged way that he actually got sent to a juvenile court and was found guilty for it. I won't recount all of the details, but honestly the word bully doesn't even accurately describe how cruel and repulsive he was to this classmate. Bill Armstrong was put in a huge bind from the get-go, as he was not the one to draft Miller despite being the team's GM. He had reached an agreement with the Blues as a condition to taking this job to not participate in the 2020 draft, but he was obviously the fall guy for the decision. He initially tried to salvage things, stating that Miller's past actions were terrible, but they were willing to give him a second chance. The public outcry was strong, however, and the Coyotes would renounce their rights to the pick by the end of the month. Regardless, this was just such an unforced error that dragged the team's reputation down even further during a time where they were actually playing well on the ice. With the pandemic ongoing, the NHL was in a tough spot to figure out a plan to play the next season while conforming with national and local health protocols. Negotiations culminated in a 56-game season with a temporary realignment of divisions to accommodate Canadian border restrictions during this time. The Coyotes were placed in the West Division, which consisted of their Pacific Division rivals from California and Las Vegas, as well as the Wild, Blues, and Avalanche from the Central. Teams would only play other teams in their division, playing multiple games against each other in a row, baseball style. As for the Coyotes, their roster remained largely the same from the year prior, with the notable departure of Taylor Hall. The team continued leaning into the Kachina jerseys, officially adopting the black one as their home jersey and a purple one of the Peyote Coyote jerseys as a reverse retro alternate. Gila River Arena also boasted a purple moon logo at center ice, a very welcome throwback to their days in downtown Phoenix. The team didn't commit to a full rebrand yet, however, as they kept the Howling Head jerseys around. The white one was still their official away jersey, as they looked to build a brand new playoff streak. The shortened season began in January 2021 as the Coyotes returned to Gila River Arena. The arena only allowed 2,000 people in attendance, all carefully spread out to avoid the spread of COVID. The Coyotes got off to a mediocre 3-4-1 start, losing 3 out of their 4 games against the Golden Knights. The team looked more like their mid-season form from the year prior, struggling to generate much offense of any kind. As February began, a sudden shakeup in the schedule was announced. With sudden COVID outbreaks affecting the Wild and Avalanche, the teams needed to postpone their games in early February. The news happened to break while the Coyotes were playing in St. Louis, and both teams just suddenly lost their upcoming opponents. The two teams were set to play each other 6 more times in the coming months, so the decision was made to just simply play those games now. After dropping the first game in the series, the Coyotes rattled off 3 consecutive wins in St. Louis. With genuine momentum on their side, the Coyotes returned home and proceeded to lay an egg by losing the next 2 games. They would win the final game of the series, though, winning this impromptu series overall 4-3. The Coyotes would continue to battle for the final playoff spot, but Kemper would go down with a lower body injury on March 8th. Ronta played well in relief, keeping the team afloat before being sidelined with yet another injury of his own. The team was down to Aiden Hill and rookie Ivan Prosvetov. They continued to get consistently inconsistent results no matter who was in net, however, as the team's offense just was not getting the job done. Phil Kessel was the only player that looked improved from the season prior, but he still wasn't exactly carrying the team to relevance. The Coyotes continued to slip out of the playoff picture through March and April, resigning themselves to the familiar realm of hockey limbo. They didn't have their first round pick this year, so this may actually be the most quintessentially Coyotes season ever. Nothing to win for, nothing to lose for, just simply continuing to exist for the sake of existing. The Coyotes finished 9 points behind the Blues for the final playoff spot in the West, and it was clear at this point that whatever window this group had was closed. The shortened season brought the NHL back to its traditional time frame, with the offseason beginning in mid-July. With things shifting closer to normal, Bill Armstrong was ready to get the team moving in a new direction with his first full offseason. The first order of business was to part ways with head coach Rick Tocchet. The Coyotes had brought him in to usher in a new era, but it ultimately was just more of the same, always near the bottom of the league in offense and having to rely on goaltending to just barely approach relevance. Because of how bizarre and tumultuous John Chayka's time at GM was, it's hard to really blame Tocchet for the team's shortcomings. He was ultimately a victim of circumstance, just like Dave Tippett before him. Andre Tourigny was named head coach soon after the team parted ways with Tocchet, and right away you could see the shifting direction for the team. Tourigny had an extensive history of coaching several levels of junior hockey, including winning Coach of the Year twice in a row in the OHL just a few years prior. With a new youth-focused coach, it was time to burn down the roster and get some assets. The team was able to acquire several second-round picks for taking on other teams' large contracts, such as Andrew Ladd and Shane Gostisbehere. On July 23, 2021, the first day of the draft, the biggest move of all was made. As previously mentioned, the Coyotes lost their first-round pick due to negligence from John Chayka. Bill Armstrong was not about to miss out on a loaded first round, and he traded Connor Garland alongside longtime captain Oliver Ekman-Larsson to the Canucks. Along with some bad Canuck contracts, the Coyotes got back the 9th overall pick in this draft, and yet another second round pick next season. Armstrong used the 9th overall pick on Dylan Guenther, one of the most promising talents in the entire draft. Armstrong would also draft Shane Doan's son Josh in the second round. The moves didn't stop there. Darcy Kemper was flipped to Colorado for a first-round pick straight up. With Antti Raanta leaving in free agency and Aiden Hill being moved to the Sharks for another draft pick, the team suddenly went from 3 solid goaltenders to 0. At the same time as this fire sale was going on, the team was suddenly rocked by the news they'd been dreading for years. Glendale chose not to renew the lease beyond this season, and this would be the team's final season in Gila River Arena. The team's future was completely up in the air, but they would have this one last season in Glendale no matter what. The Kachina had slowly been coming back into the team's brand for the last several years, and the time finally came for them to fully embrace the past. The White Kachinas finally made their return as the team's official away uniform, bringing the era of the Howling Head to an end after 19 years. As October came, veteran goaltender Carter Hutton was named the starter ahead of a few prospects. Hutton wasted no time getting absolutely shellacked in the season opener against Columbus. Despite the Coyotes outshooting the Blue Jackets 38-26, Hutton allowed a ridiculous 8 goals on the night, not being pulled at any point. The next night, rookie Karel Vejmelka would start in net and stop 32 Sabre shots, but the team would eventually lose in the shootout. For some unexplained and unknown reason, Hutton was back in net for the home opener against the Blues. Things were fine for the first half of the game. The Coyotes held a 2-1 lead until halfway through the second. The following sequence really just needs to be seen to be believed. The Blues scored 5 goals in the next 5 minutes, and the terrible defense and goaltending made it look like a scrimmage. Vejmelka would start the next 2 games of the homestand, but the team remained winless. The Coyotes began a 6-game Eastern road trip, and Hutton was back as the team's starter. For the first period at least, before he was pulled. This would be the end of Hutton's Coyotes tenure, with a goals against average of 7.76 and a 7.41 save percentage. Although, it would be unfair to completely scapegoat Hutton for the 0-5-1 start, as the team was completely hollowed out and couldn't get wins with anybody in net. The losing continued to pile on against these Eastern Conference powerhouses, and even against the Flyers. A 3-1 loss in Anaheim brought the Coyotes to an 0-10-1 record once again, tying the worst start in NHL history for the second time in 5 seasons. Well, there's one lifeline you can always rely on when your team starts off on an 11-game losing streak, and he just so happened to be on waivers from the Devils. That's right, in some insane twist of fate, Scott Wedgwood was back in the desert. In the team's return home from their road trip, and first ever game against the Seattle Kraken, Vejmelka let in 2 goals in the first minute of the game. Tyranny had seen enough, and it was Wedgwood time. After a defensive breakdown led to another Seattle goal, Wedgwood settled in and held down the fort while the Coyotes' offense finally showed some life. They came back from a 3-1 deficit to win the game 5-4 in regulation, with Wedgwood saving 27 Kraken shots along the way. If I had a nickel for every time Scott Wedgwood got the Coyotes their first win after an 0-10-1 start, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's genuinely insane that it happened twice, especially in the span of 5 years. With this single win in their hands, the Coyotes continued to play poorly, finding themselves on a 6-game losing streak in early December. At that same time, on December 8th, 2021, the team was informed that they would be locked out of Gila River Arena in 12 days due to an unpaid tax bill. Thankfully, the situation was resolved by the time the deadline was hit, but this was truly emblematic of the team's strained relationship with Glendale and lackluster attention to team operations. The team still didn't have a home for next season, and Meruelo needed to find one, and fast. A month later, the Coyotes announced that they reached an agreement to use Arizona State University's new hockey stadium as a temporary home while they figured out long-term arena plans. The arena was never planned to host an NHL team, and had a capacity of just 5,000 seats. This is less than half of the size of the next smallest NHL arena and seats 12,000 fewer people than Gila River Arena does. The Coyotes never had too many sellouts in Glendale, but even the least attended games sold much more than 5,000 tickets. Back on the ice, the Coyotes continued losing at a relentless pace. Occasionally, they would get a random offensive burst or elite Vejmelka start to steal a win, but make no mistake, this team was absolutely atrocious. A horse blend of fourth liners that couldn't crack other teams' rosters, and a bunch of old guys that were in the twilight of their career, all culminating in one of the worst teams in the NHL that season, and quite possibly the worst Coyotes team of all time. The 0-10-1 start somehow wasn't even the most pathetic part of the season. Oh no, that came in early spring. They lost 6 in a row, looking increasingly weak as the streak went on. They did manage to defeat the Sharks and Blackhawks to not let it snowball into a bigger streak. After this, though, they began a catastrophic stretch of 6 games where they were outscored 7-38. They straight up didn't look like a professional hockey team, just completely lost and waiting for the season to end. The losing streak would reach 10 games, somehow breaking it on the road against the playoff-bound Wild. The season was winding down though, and the Coyotes had dropped their previous 7 home games with only one more left to play. The final game at Gila River Arena was against the Nashville Predators, where the Preds got out to a very quick 4-0 lead in the first period. Vejmelka was pulled for career minor leaguer Harri Sateri, and he was surprisingly locked in and stopped the bleeding. The Coyotes continued to slowly chip away at Connor Ingram on the other end, eventually tying the game up at 4 in the third period. The decisive 5th goal, and the final goal in Gila River Arena history, was scored by Shane Gostisbehere. The first game in this arena was a 3-1 loss to the Predators back in December 2003, and 19 years later the Coyotes ended their time in Glendale with their revenge. Even with their catastrophic stretch in April, this final victory once again caused the team to finish second to last in the standings. The Montreal Canadiens were in the Stanley Cup Finals in 2021, and yet somehow finished 2 points lower than the Coyotes to nab the top odds in the draft lottery. For good measure, the Coyotes got moved down to the 3rd pick as the Devils moved up to number 2. I guess it was a repayment for Wedgwood breaking the team out of their winless spell again. The 2022 draft saw several interesting developments. All season long, Shane Wright was seen as the top prospect that everybody was tanking for. Shockingly enough, though, the Canadiens didn't take him first overall, and the Devils passed by him as well. The top prospect in the whole draft slid down to the Coyotes, but Bill Armstrong stuck to his draft board and selected Logan Cooley instead. It shocked many fans and analysts at the time, but with speculation that Wright didn't want to play in Arizona, this was the correct call for Armstrong to make. Shane Wright would be picked number 4 by the Seattle Kraken, and shortly afterwards it was time for a draft day trade. Bill Armstrong moved up, sending the 27th pick and a few second-rounders to San Jose for the 11th pick, which he used to select Connor Geekie. Getting 2 guys named Cooley and Geekie was pretty funny, but their potential had fans around the valley excited for the future, even if the future would be in a college stadium. Just for a little bit, right? Because Mullett Arena was built with collegiate play in mind, the Coyotes had to wait for the arena to be retrofitted to NHL standards. Things like replay cameras, broadcast booths, and locker room upgrades that aren't necessary for a college team. This resulted in the Coyotes' schedule starting off with a 6-game road trip, playing 4 in a row at Mullett afterwards, and then embarking on a Goliath 13-game road trip that would last for over a month. This was the second longest road trip in NHL history, only surpassed by the 2010 Vancouver Canucks, whose arena was being used for the Winter Olympics. All things considered, I think Vancouver fans were a lot happier with their road trip. The Coyotes roster remained largely unchanged from the season prior, with the most notable changes being the departure of Phil Kessel and the signing of Nashville's Connor Ingram. They were still firmly in the rebuild, but the simple passage of time allowed more playing time for the team's young players and prospects. They also adopted a new orange version of the Peyote Coyote for an alternate jersey this season. The Coyotes embarked on their epic voyage in Pittsburgh, where they have not won since 2014. That streak continued with a 6-2 rout, and another loss in TD Garden pointed towards yet another terrible start to the season. Thankfully, a decisive 4-2 win in Toronto saved the team from needing to go find Scott Wedgwood again. They even picked up another win in Columbus to finish off their first trip, and they headed home to their new digs. The NHL accommodations lowered the capacity of the stadium to just 4,600. Mullett Arena is the only arena in any major American sport without an upper level, and a lot of focus was put into selling the intimacy of the arena. There isn't a single bad seat in the house, and you can clearly hear the players on the ice. The first game in Mullett Arena was against the Winnipeg Jets, because of course it was. The Coyotes got out to an early 2-0 lead, and the goal horn wasn't even working, which perfectly fit the whole situation. Even though the Coyotes eventually lost in overtime, the crowd was plenty loud, and everything looked normal for a TV audience. A lot of attention was drawn to the locker rooms, as they more closely resembled a high school gym than an NHL venue. The locker rooms were still under construction at the time, but the completed versions were still not built to NHL standards. The team ultimately lost 3 out of 4 in the homestand, and it was time for the enormous road trip to begin in the nation's capital. In net on the other side was a very familiar face, Darcy Kuemper. Kuemper had won the Stanley Cup in his one-year stint with the Avalanche and got a nice payday from the Capitals. For the first 2 periods, he remained the brick wall that the Coyotes remembered fondly, holding a 1-0 lead for Washington. The third period turned the game on its head though, adding 3 unanswered to shock the Capitals in regulation. The Coyotes followed this up with a decisive 4-1 win in Buffalo and a 2-0 shutout against the Islanders. As the road trip went on, however, the losses began to pile up one after another. There was one bizarre break, a 4-0 win in Carolina, who had just finished a 116-point season and were on track to have another. This 36-save shutout was an anomaly, as it was their only win in the final 11 games of this grueling road trip. The first game back home in the now fully complete Mullett Arena was against the Boston Bruins. The odds were tremendously stacked against the Coyotes. Not only have they not defeated Boston at all since their 2010 Prague series, but the Bruins were also having the best start in NHL history. Their record stood at 21-3-1, with those few losses being to their fellow playoff teams. 23 seconds into the game, Josh Brown gave the Coyotes an early lead that silenced the Bruins' chance at Mullett Arena. The Bruins dominated possession from there, but the Coyotes made the most of their opportunities and found themselves in a tied game deep in the third period. With 20 seconds left, everybody in the building was expecting an icing call after Chychrun cleared the zone, but the linesman waves it off as Matias Maccelli pounces on the Bruins to set up Krause's game winner. The Coyotes were outshot 46-16, but pulled off the most miraculous upset in team history. The Coyotes finished December strong, but reality once again set in as they began 2023 with 9 regulation losses in a row. Around this time, Jacob Chychrun was traded to Ottawa for several draft picks, including Ottawa's first-round pick this year. The Senators were going for a playoff push as the Coyotes continued to slip back down into hockey limbo. They weren't as hapless as they were last season, nor as hapless as the Ducks, Sharks, or Blackhawks. The team would end the month of March with a 9-game losing streak, and they would limp to the finish line with 70 points. While most of the team was struggling to find their new identity, Clayton Keller had the best season of his young career. He scored 37 goals and put up a career-high 86 points, tying Keith Tkachuk's record set in the team's inaugural season. Keller had been developing into the next face of the franchise, and this season cemented his place at the center of their new core. This team had a legit youth movement, for real this time, and development was at the forefront of every decision they were making. The 2023 draft came, and the late season freefall gave the Coyotes the 6th overall pick. They went on to select defenseman Dmitry Simashev, which surprised many people at the time. The Senators had a late season collapse of their own, and the Coyotes used their pick to select Danil But, Simashev's teammate from the KHL. Because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, many teams were hesitant to invest in scouting in Russia, but Bill Armstrong's scouting team was a major exception. The hope is that their chemistry will carry on into the pros, but only time will tell. Unfortunately though, it was time for even more arena drama. With the team playing in a 4,600-seat arena, much of the season went on with speculation in the background as to what the team would do next. Alex Meruelo worked with the city of Tempe to create a proposal for a new entertainment district on the west side of town to be voted on by the citizens of the city. This was set to include not just the arena, but a separate theater building and nearly 2,000 multifamily residential units. The site that was chosen is a literal, actual toxic waste dump that regularly catches on fire. There was no displacement taking place, no eminent domain used to take people's houses. and it was to be primarily privately funded. The only public funding was to remove the toxic waste dump, which would have been a net positive for the city anyway. This was such a resounding slam dunk of a proposal, the kind of deal that would make all sides happy in the end. So, what happened? That's right, the Tempe voters came out and voted to keep the toxic waste dump. In the weeks leading up to the vote, a group called Tempe.4 emerged from the woodworks to oppose the arena vote. Their Twitter bio reads, Tempe.4 is an all-volunteer, bipartisan group of Tempe residents who want to give Tempe voters the final say in the use of taxes, land, and public resources. The group made a conscious and expensive effort to spread misinformation about the arena deal, appealing to voters that were led to believe that their tax dollars would be funneled into the project. They also went after younger voters by hijacking progressive messaging to portray Meruelo as some sort of robber baron that wants to ruin the city of Tempe with a wasteful project. This was just simply not true. The only taxpayer funds going towards the project were to clear up the, once again, actual literal toxic waste dump that posed health hazards to the community. From some photos of the Tempe streets before the vote, the amount of no signs littering the street corners outnumbered the yes signs significantly, and the sheer amount of money behind the movement was enough to sway voters at the ballot box. The vote came as a complete shock to everybody involved. Even Gary Bettman was left dumbfounded that one of the most generous arena proposals in league history was voted down. The former mayor of Tempe also commented that he would not see that landfill be redeveloped in his lifetime, and that this was the best chance for the city to finally get rid of it. Ownership clearly didn't do their due diligence and did not assuage voters' concerns about how the arena would affect them, even if the fears were unfounded. They also failed to come to an agreement with labor unions, which created its own set of problems during the process and contributed to the failure of the proposal. Meruelo's ownership was turning out to be a failure of catastrophic proportions, as they were now stuck in this embarrassing arena situation that was supposed to be temporary. Immediately, speculation arose that the Coyotes would relocate for the upcoming season. This was quickly silenced, though, as the Coyotes committed to playing the upcoming season in Mullett Arena as they had contractually agreed to do. In the background, though, the future of the team was in complete disarray. Meruelo was quick to get back to the drawing board for a new arena, and there were several potential sites in Mesa that gained speculation, one of which being the former Fiesta Mall. Solutions kept being floated during the off-season, but the 2023-24 season would arrive with no plans set in stone, and the future of the franchise up in the air entirely. The Coyotes unveiled yet another new alternate jersey during the off-season, this time moving away from the Kachina head. This one is maroon with sand coloring on the accents and numbers. From the back, this may actually be my favorite Coyotes jersey, but they just had to ruin it with this credit union-ass logo on the front. The 23-24 season began with a familiar East Coast road trip, where the Coyotes actually won their opening game in New Jersey. This marked the first time that they won their first game of the season since 2016-17, the final year of Shane Doan and Dave Tippett's Coyotes tenure. The vibe of this team was certainly different from the get-go, giving up fewer goals overall and playing a more solid offensive game. On October 30th, the Chicago Blackhawks came into town with the number 1 pick in the last draft, Connor Bedard. Bedard dazzled right away by scoring less than a minute into the game, but the Coyotes stormed back very quickly to overrun the Blackhawks 8-1. Right off the bat, this year's edition of the Coyotes proved themselves to be extremely streaky. A 5-game winning streak around Thanksgiving gave way to a 4-game losing streak in early December, immediately followed up by a 4-game winning streak. They kept up pace in the wildcard race with the Blues, who were dealing with their own issues of streakiness. Just like clockwork, though, on January 24th, the annual winter collapse began. 3 straight losses to Florida, Tampa, and Carolina led into the All-Star break, where the hope was that they were just losing to quality playoff teams. After play resumed in February, though, those hopes were quickly dashed and stomped on. They played Vegas and Nashville close in their first games back, but after returning home to Mullett Arena, the Coyotes were routinely bullied off the ice. Their loss streak would reach 11 as they were routed by the Maple Leafs on February 21st, and the end seemed to be nowhere in sight as the team embarked on a 5-game Canadian road trip. After 2 hard-fought losses to the Jets and Canadiens, the Coyotes took their 13-loss streak into Toronto. Surprisingly, the Coyotes hadn't lost a game in Toronto since 2002, so there was a lot on the line for this game. Either the catastrophic slide for the Coyotes continued, or the playoff-bound Leafs cement their curse against the Coyotes. Unfortunately, it was the former, as the Coyotes suffered another hard-fought loss in regulation. Fun fact, two noted Coyotes fans scored for the Leafs in this game, Austin Matthews and Matty Knees. The losing streak would mercifully end the next day in Ottawa at 14 games. The Coyotes started off this losing streak with a winning record and were solid playoff contenders. Now, they were back once again in hockey limbo, the all-too-familiar realm that this franchise truly calls home. They'll beat a playoff team on the road and then come back to Mullett Arena to lose to the Blackhawks. Completely random results from an inconsistent young team with nothing to play for and nothing to tank for. This pattern continued through March 25th, when the surprise decision was made to call Josh Doan up to the NHL. That night, Josh had an immediate positive impact on the team's offense against the Blue Jackets. 16 minutes into the second period, Josh scored his first NHL goal, and Shane could not be happier. He would score again in the 6-2 win, and for one beautiful day, Josh Doan had the most goals per game in NHL history. Josh continued his strong play down the stretch, but after a brutal 5-0 loss to the Kraken, the hockey world was rocked with major news. On April 10th, 2024, the NHL had drafted alternate schedules for the upcoming season for the Coyotes. One schedule in Tempe and one in Salt Lake City. The flames of speculation were being quickly fanned around the hockey world, while the Coyotes were up in Vancouver getting ready to take on the Canucks. Despite the circumstances and getting blown out the night before, the Coyotes entered Rogers Place and gave the Canucks everything they had. Dylan Guenther assisted on the first two Coyotes goals and cashed in with one of his own to make it 3-1. Former Coyote Connor Garland would strike back, however, and the Canucks scored again 5 minutes later to take it to overtime. Deep into the 3-on-3, Sean Durzi finds Dylan Guenther, who secured his fourth point of the night off a beautiful shot from Logan Cooley. The following days saw speculation turn into a cold reality, and on April 12th, the news was solidified. Bill Armstrong flew out to Edmonton that night to inform the players that the team would be moving to Salt Lake City the next season. The team only had 3 games left, could not move anywhere in the standings, and now wouldn't even have their city next year. The team could have rolled over and died, but they came out looking more focused than ever. Josh Doan put the Coyotes in front in the first period, as they once again took a Pacific powerhouse to overtime. A few minutes into the extra period, Matias Maccelli absolutely roofed it over former Coyote Calvin Pickard to secure another improbable win. The Coyotes made the familiar trek from Edmonton to Calgary to face the Flames on the 14th, where 2 quick goals for both sides and a fight set the tone early. Dylan Guenther and Josh Doan put the Coyotes ahead in the second period, but 2 Nazem Kadri goals in the third period sealed the win for Calgary. There was only one game left, April 17th, 2024 versus the Oilers, the last professional game at Mullett Arena and the last game for the Arizona Coyotes. Many fans were planning to make this game one final whiteout, and on the day of the game, the team's Twitter account chimed in to spread the word. Before the game, Shane Doan was reunited with his retirement banner that was previously missing from Desert Diamond Arena. In the hasty move from Glendale to Tempe, the Meruelo ownership completely neglected to bring along anything Coyotes related, and the banner was just sitting in an arena worker's living room this whole time. It's some sort of beautiful poetry that came out of this depressing situation. Once the final game began, Liam O'Brien got the Coyotes on the board first, with Maccelli, Krause, Guenther, and finally Sean Durzi scoring all the final goals in Coyotes history in the 5-2 win. Connor Ingram was the last goaltender the team defeated in Glendale just 2 years ago, and now he stood as the final Coyote to record a win. The game was full of chants such as, "Utah sucks," but the most emotional time was immediately after the final buzzer. The players waved their sticks to the crowd and went to center ice with all of the team staff to get a group photo. The fans stuck around for some time afterwards, not wanting to say goodbye to the team they had given so much of their lives cheering for. Eventually, though, the send-off was over, and the Arizona Coyotes were officially deactivated the following day. With the May 2023 rejection of the Tempe arena plan, the Coyotes brass spent the rest of the year panicking and attempting to find a new arena plan. Eventually, they landed on a parcel of land at the northwest corner of Scottsdale Road and the Loop 101, in the northeast corner of the valley. In January 2024, the Coyotes unveiled their official plans to buy the land at auction on June 27, 2024. Just like the Tempe renderings, the complex was to include not only an arena, but also residential and office buildings. Cracks immediately began showing with this proposal. Even though the process itself seemed to be going along smoothly, many outside voices stressed their disagreement with the move. Most notably, the mayor of Scottsdale came out with strong opposition to the project, citing the intensive resources required to run a stadium that's just across the street from his city. It would only take a few months for this to become a footnote in the age-old local arena debate, though, once the rumors of relocation became a reality. The news came out of nowhere on April 10th, and closely followed the pattern of previously relocated franchises such as the Atlanta Thrashers. When the news hits, the NHL prefers to rip it off like a band-aid. April 18th is the date that continued to circulate after the news broke, which lined up perfectly with the end of the regular season. Ownership was radio silent, a fact acknowledged by Meruelo himself in a public statement on the 13th. Once the fateful day of April 18th hit, ownership's silence was broken, and the team was officially moved to Utah. In an incredibly awkward press conference afterwards, Bettman revealed that he told Meruelo about the relocation on March 6th, and Meruelo was staunchly opposed to it. Meruelo did nobody any favors during this press conference, where he was visibly uncomfortable and expressed his negative views on the media directly to the media. Meruelo spent the press conference reaffirming his commitment to hockey in Arizona, which rang even more hollow now than it did when the team still existed. The Coyotes were officially deactivated on April 18th, and the new Utah team would be treated as an expansion team in the record books. The original Jets' history would be returned to Winnipeg, and the Coyotes' history would remain dormant in the desert. The bitter irony of the Coyotes moving is where they decided to move to. Instead of the common refrains we're used to hearing like Houston, Kansas City, or even Quebec City, they ended up in Salt Lake City, a metropolitan area a quarter the size of Phoenix, in a state with less than half the population of Arizona. Utah doesn't even have an NHL-ready arena yet, so the currently named Utah Hockey Club will have to play in the Delta Center for the foreseeable future. The Delta Center was built in 1991 for the NBA's Utah Jazz with basketball in mind, and as a result there are several sections of obstructed view seats around the stadium. The plan for the future of the franchise is a publicly funded NHL-tailored arena downtown to revitalize a stagnant but important town center. Sound familiar? Fortunately for Utah fans, Ryan Smith is actually a committed professional sports owner, and the local government is actually welcoming them with open arms. Even though their beginnings are eerily similar to the Coyotes, they're already on track to be more successful. There's not a doubt in my mind the Utah Hockey Club, or whatever they rebrand to, will at least make the playoffs within the next 3 years. I wouldn't be shocked at all to see the Stanley Cup in Salt Lake City in the near future either. After all, they're not the Coyotes anymore. That franchise deactivated, and all of their history and associated curses are still stuck in Arizona. Alex Meruelo's final pathetic gasp to bring the Coyotes back himself was dealt a major blow on June 21st. The city of Phoenix abruptly canceled the land auction only a week before it was set to happen. The now defunct franchise took to Twitter to voice their disappointment with the decision. Once again, Meruelo did not do the proper due diligence on his own master plan, and did not secure the proper permits to even enter the auction. This final showing of ineptitude cemented that moving the team was unfortunately the right decision for the NHL to make. On June 24, 2024, the Florida Panthers defeated the Edmonton Oilers to win their franchise's first Stanley Cup. Former Coyotes Nick Cousins and Oliver Ekman-Larsson achieved what was ultimately impossible in Arizona, in a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. Mere hours after the cup was awarded to the Panthers, Alex Meruelo announced that he would be stepping down as the owner of the Coyotes franchise and return the brand to the NHL. He would maintain ownership of the Tucson Roadrunners and continues to dangle the threat of relocation to Reno over their heads. He may not be fully out of the picture yet, but good riddance to the Coyotes' harbinger of death. Alex Meruelo pulled the wool over everybody's eyes, from fans to executives, all the way up to the commissioner himself. Several years before he even took ownership of the Coyotes, he had failed ownership bids for the NBA's Charlotte Bobcats and Atlanta Hawks. He was simply outbid by Michael Jordan for the Bobcats, but the attempted purchase of the Hawks went further. He essentially was celebrated as the new owner in 2011. By November 2011, though, his ownership bid was withdrawn. The majority of existing owners were concerned that he didn't have proper financing for team operations, despite him flouting his wealth constantly. After this failure in Atlanta, he took a break for a while to focus on the hospitality industry, such as the renovation of the SLS Las Vegas. He even bought a damn island in the Mediterranean during this time. By 2018, though, he was ready to get back into it, and the NHL was seemingly just happy to have someone ostensibly wealthy to show interest in the most troubled team in the league. There was seemingly no vetting process similar to the NBA's, as that would have shown the exact same problems that ended his Hawks bid. Arizona hockey fans weren't exactly aware of his past, and we were just happy to see an apparent billionaire swoop in and possibly save the team. We all ate up his initial press conference, where he proudly stated that he'll sure as shit want to win. After all, this was after 2 decades of apathy and incompetence at the helm while the team continued to bleed money. Right off the bat, Alex Meruelo was a very absent owner, and delegated day-to-day operations to team president Javier Gutierrez and his completely unqualified and untalented son. It didn't take long for the team to get involved in a scandal by selecting Mitchell Miller in the 4th round of the 2020 draft. Since Bill Armstrong was not allowed to participate in this draft, that horrendous pick had to have been approved by upper management within the organization. It really just screams, I didn't do my homework and just picked the guy with a lot of points. Even back then, a simple Google search would have told them why all the other 30 teams in the league were passing on this asshole. Morelo's complete lack of tact and knowledge of the business continued to be a drag on the franchise. It finally reared its ugly head in 2021 when the Coyotes were locked out of Gila River Arena due to an unpaid tax bill. This is something that is so routine that I can't even find any other instance of an owner failing to do it. Meruelo chalked it up to human error, but this plain incompetence combined with the lack of accountability was the defining feature of his time as owner. Plus, considering the fact that the Coyotes had become notorious for not paying hotel or food bills around this time, it's safe to assume that Meruelo just didn't want to pay his tax bill. In just 2 short years of ownership, he managed to completely burn the bridge between the team and the city of Glendale, a relationship that, while certainly sour beforehand, had been successfully navigated by people much less wealthy than himself. The Coyotes were left without a home in 2022 and needed to play in a college arena. Mullett Arena was brand new at the very least, and it did signify a genuine connection between the two programs after years of stalled negotiations. Regardless, an NHL team playing in a 5,000-seat college arena is not only embarrassing, but it actively hurts the reputation of the league as a whole. While so much focus was being put into selling the intimacy of the new tiny arena, the ownership group remained closed off. Why else do you think I keep using the same 3 pictures of him from when he signed on as owner? Alex Meruelo kept his son in charge of whatever he wanted in day-to-day operations, and he ruled with an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. That's the last thing a franchise on death's door needed, especially coming from someone who's just playing around with daddy's money. While the team was being run on a shoestring budget by this billionaire owner, he had no problem spending top dollar on a new fashion designer for the team at the behest of Junior. This collaboration brought a bunch of mediocre, overpriced apparel that wasn't very widely popular. A lot of it wasn't even available through the team's official store, and those that were available just looked like regular streetwear with no connection to the team. Their final Desert Knights jersey was also designed by this guy, and the incredibly lazy cactus on the pants that looks like it was made in MS Paint combined with the ugly credit union-ass logo on the front really makes me question this whole venture. The complete apathy from Meruelo himself continued to cause issues when the team needed to spread word about their new arena plans. He put the team in such a terrible situation that the Tempe voters opted to keep the, and I can't stress this enough, literal toxic waste dump instead of building a new arena. He made absolutely no effort to spread the word about his side of this vital vote, and he was defeated by good old-fashioned misinformation. Losing that vote was the final nail in the coffin for the team, even as Alex continued to desperately flail for any possible arena option to keep the circus going. Thanks to Meruelo, the team was on their way out of town. Even when the Coyotes were about to be relocated, the depths of this ownership's ineptitude and complete apathy towards itself was highlighted one final time. Shane Doan's retirement banner had been mysteriously missing from Mullett Arena this whole time, and that's because it was completely discarded by Meruelo. The absolute nerve and gall to leave behind the only tangible piece of history that this team has, it can seriously never be understated. That's the kind of thing that can only be done out of malice or complete disregard for what the hell you even own. Imagine moving into a new house and forgetting all of the furniture from your old house. That's pretty much exactly what he did in 2022. After the banner was returned to Doane, it found a new home at the Ice Den in Scottsdale, the final bastion of hockey in Arizona. That leads us to present day, where the Coyotes no longer exist and the fruits of their first properly done rebuild will blossom in Salt Lake City. No matter what way he tries to spin it, this was Alex Meruelo's choice. At any point along the way, he could have chosen to be a more active owner and not sleepwalk the team into these various self-made pitfalls that led to this horrible outcome. Even if he was truly blindsided by the NHL's intentions to move the team in March, he really shouldn't have been. What else would you expect when you got yourself stuck in a college arena for at least the next 4 seasons, with no arena even close to being built? Did this dumbass really think the NHL was just gonna let them keep playing in Mullett Arena forever? Well, he almost certainly didn't. After all, he was set to win an indescribable amount of wealth for sinking this franchise into the ground. He had every incentive in the world to not care about the Coyotes, and his actions or lack thereof as owner made that clear. The Coyotes were just one of many things for him to own, in the incredibly warped reality that billionaire real estate moguls live in. He bought the team for the most naive and out-of-touch reason, because his son wanted one. Nobody watching this video right now can relate to having the means to fulfill such a childish and ridiculous wish, but Alex Meruelo decided to make it all of our problems. I highly recommend reading Steve Peters' open letter to Alex Meruelo if you would like a closer look at how operations were under him. Under Meruelo's ownership, team operations seemed to embody all of the worst traits of venture capitalism, a high-strung environment that's entirely focused on cost-cutting, whether it was the roster of the team itself or the tools the staff behind the scenes needed, like computers or printers. The vibe was closer to a public school having to deal with budget cuts rather than a professional hockey team, giving off the impression of making a profit rather than doing the work necessary to be successful in the sports business. Needless to say, this team was dead from the moment he stepped on board. Eat shit, Alex Meruelo, and may the tale of your cataclysmic ownership tenure live on in infamy alongside the likes of Harold Ballard. The Coyotes were truly a one-of-a-kind disaster, constantly finding new ways to disappoint those loyal fans that stuck by them. Whether it was factors outside the team's control, terrible ownership, horrendous roster construction, or good old-fashioned underperforming, nothing could ever go right for this team. This has been an incredibly unlucky franchise from the very beginning, all the way back to their days in Winnipeg. After a successful 70s in the WHA, the Jets spent the 80s and early 90s playing second fiddle to their rivals in Alberta, never advancing further than the semifinals in a very lenient playoff system. Financial problems forced the team to move to Phoenix, Arizona in 1996, where they made an immediate positive impression with the locals. Hockey was non-existent in the area at the time, but now that the Phoenix Coyotes were in town, the scene grew tremendously over the years. The Coyotes were competitive in their first half-decade in the desert, but they failed to make even the slightest amount of noise in the playoffs, failing to win a series in their 6 attempts in downtown Phoenix. The team continued to operate at a loss as interest waned for a declining product. The Coyotes had long needed a new arena, and owner Steve Ellman promised to be the one to get it done. After several years of failing to get it built at the Los Arcos Mall site that he already owned, he cheaped out and moved the team 17 miles west of downtown Phoenix. The move to Glendale Arena in 2003 coincided with a rebrand for the team, and unfortunately also coincided with the 2004 lockout. The product on the ice suffered for the next half-decade as the disinterested businessmen at the helm continued to run the franchise into the ground. The team was never profitable from the get-go, but the first 5 years in Glendale turned the Coyotes from just another struggling team in a non-traditional market into a legitimate financial problem for the league. The NHL took ownership of the team after a very ugly bankruptcy dispute in 2009, and the few years of relative stability up top showed us what this team was capable of being. Coach Dave Tippett was the perfect fit for Captain Coyote Shane Doane, and the gritty group of veterans found their way back into the playoffs. They were defeated by Detroit 2 seasons in a row, but in 2012, they finally broke their curse by advancing all the way to the Western Conference Finals. It was a magical run that truly poised to put hockey back on the map in Arizona after a scandalous decade in the desert. And just when they had given existing fans hope and drawn in a brand new generation of hockey fans across the valley, it was back to underperforming and constant drama behind the scenes. They failed at competing, they failed at tanking, they failed at drafting, they failed at developing talent, and they ultimately wasted Shane Doan's career just floundering around in hockey limbo. Once Doan retired and there was much change around the organization, the Rick Tocchet era got off to a catastrophic 0-10-1 start, but rebounded to simply just be mediocre again. In 2020, they managed to make the playoffs thanks to a pandemic-specific playoff format, but that fun was short-lived. The team was stuck in neutral thanks to negligence from John Chaika at GM, and he was replaced by Bill Armstrong. Armstrong replaced Rick Tocchet with Andre Tourigny and tore the roster down to its foundations. Just in time for a full switch back to the Kachina jerseys, the Andre Tourigny era got off to another catastrophic 0-10-1 start. The Coyotes managed to tie for the worst start in NHL history twice in 5 seasons, both times to start off a bald guy's coaching tenure, and both times the same goalie ended the losing streak, Scott Wedgwood. After they moved to Mullett Arena in 2022, the team was back to the familiar realm of hockey limbo, too bad to compete for a playoff spot, but just good enough to not get any of the high draft picks. But the final year of the team's existence really showed something special on the horizon. The fruits of Bill Armstrong and Andre Tourigny's labor, the future that we had been waiting for throughout our time as Coyotes fans. Logan Cooley, Dylan Guenther, Matthias Michelli, Josh Doan for God's sake, and then all of a sudden, it's just gone. It's just up in Utah now. A place that, generously, will have the same challenges facing them in the future that Arizona did, regardless of how successful they are on the ice. But for the players and coaches of this long-tortured team, this is the kind of fresh start they've needed. The increasingly disastrous Meruelo ownership had taken its toll on the fan base for sure, but actually having to deal with the substandard facilities and nonsense behind the scenes every single day? I'd be excited for a clean slate in Utah too, even if the arena's still not perfect. I keep thinking about how rough it's going to be seeing all these former Coyotes thrive in their new environment. Seeing the heavy hitters of Keller and Cooley compete in the bland temporary Utah jerseys, or seeing our old prospects make the team once they've rebranded to the Yeti or whatever worse name they'll come up with. But it got significantly less sad for me when I realized that we'd been watching that happen already for the past half decade. Whether it was Darcy Kemper, Aiden Hill, or most recently Oliver Ekman-Larsson, there's no shortage of former Coyotes going on to achieve greater things. Things that were ultimately never possible in Arizona, actually making their mark on hockey history instead of being permanently attached to its most depressing footnote. The Coyotes embodied the spirit of Charlie Brown right until the bitter end. For nearly 30 years they went to kick the ball, saw Lucy pull it away from them, and dusted themselves off and went back to trying again. Everything can change in just the blink of an eye though. Lucy's no longer pulling the ball away. She's suddenly moved to Utah, and Charlie's just left all alone. He always hated the feeling of falling on his back, but now that the game was gone, he would do anything to have it back again. The team was the laughingstock of the NHL for most of its existence, and being a fan required more following of local politics than actual hockey, but now that the team is gone, there's just a void that can't be filled. I became a fan of this team in middle school, during their 2012 playoff run. It came at such a formative time of my life, and all of the real-life hype that I saw from my classmates and the fan base at large caused me to buy into sports as a whole. From 2013 through 2019, I made sure to attend every home opener, among countless other games, and was in the building when Shane Doan's jersey finally went into the rafters at Gila River Arena. Even though they only gave me a terrible product for the whole time I watched them, the Coyotes still had a hugely positive influence on my life. I only speak of my experience because I know that this team has had a similar effect on so many of us, especially for those of you that have been watching them for longer than I have. They were always a group that knew they were looked upon as outsiders, and no matter how much resistance they faced, they would always find a way to move forward. And if the players didn't necessarily fit that role, the fan base certainly embodies those traits better than any other. There's quite literally no other franchise in American sports that had it as bad as Coyotes fans, yet we're still here, even after the team's gone. It's always been fun to be a part of the pack, whether it was celebrating a win in person or tuning into pack therapy on PHNX after a tough loss. It feels like I genuinely lost a good friend on April 17th, 2024, and I know that I'm not alone in that feeling. Every time I think about the ending of this saga, I start to tear up, and I feel a certain bitterness. Arizona deserved better, the players deserved better, and the fans of this corpse of a franchise definitely deserved better. If the team had proper investment and ownership, who knows what could have been? There's no inherent reason that places like Tampa Bay, Las Vegas, or Nashville are better hockey markets than Phoenix. Their teams just spent their time actually trying to win rather than being content just simply existing. As much as it pains me to say it, the history of their first attempt in Arizona will likely deter them from going back there over other, sexier options for future expansion. Especially as long as there continues to be no viable arena option in the Valley. But I don't know. You don't know either. I mean, it's still 2024. The Utah Hockey Club's still in their inaugural season. They haven't even branded to real jerseys yet. For all I know, in the next 5 years, Matt Ishbia of the Suns could just solve all these problems by building a dual-use stadium for basketball and hockey. Or absolutely nothing happens. All I know is that hockey does belong in Arizona. The freezing indoor ice rinks are a perfect respite from the harsh desert heat. And during the hockey season, the weather is perfect. It's a game that we all desperately want to love, but it hasn't loved us back. Whether it's ownership woes, or arena drama, or just being terrible and irrelevant for decades, there hasn't exactly been too much to cheer about as a Coyotes fan. And now, the comfortable mediocrity of this team has now been swallowed by the existential dread that was surrounding it for decades. Who knows if professional hockey will ever return to Arizona? I certainly don't. We'll never truly know what the future holds, but knowing what the past has given us is the best way that we can keep moving forward towards a brighter and better future. Keep on howlin' till we meet again. Remembering the Coyotes.